So collaboration seems to be a constant in your career. You founded the Propeller Group in 2006, and then in 2007 you founded Sound Art with Đinh Kiêu Lê, Phù Nam, and Tiffany Chung.
Yeah.
So can you share with me about those collaboration, and is it different between your individual practice and the collaborative works?
I would say, I mean, my individual practice is very much about collaboration. And you know, these projects like San Art or the Propeller Group, I see them as major kind of moments in my own long-term individual practice. A lot of the projects I do individually are collaborative. I work with communities, or I work with sites that have gone through different moments in history, different traumas. I think about how we as people relate to each other, you know, and our relationships cause and create politics. They create conflicts, or they create friendships, they create solidarities, they encourage different empathies and different compassions. And I think, you know, actualizing those things is what collaboration is, right? When you have a relationship with someone and you make something together, that's all of those really complicated human relationships at play. So yeah, collaboration is very, very important to me. And just always thinking about different ways to collaborate. I'm also very much fascinated about storytelling. You know, I'm not a very good storyteller, but I am so invested in listening to other people's stories. There are so many good stories out there, and so many kind of stories that have kind of remained unheard or intentionally erased historically, that I feel need to be told. So I feel like I can be a conduit to tell, or to help tell those stories. And that is, I think, where my collaborative process situates itself.
You said that you don't think that you're a good storyteller, but I do believe that it is actually precisely through your storytelling, through a lot of your works, that really gives a character, a definite character to the kind of works that you make and the kind of works that we expect from you in a way. And I think across a lot of your works, like we see from The Island to The Spectre of Ancestors Becoming, and recently A Dream of the End, at the End of a Dream, you see this kind of not repeated, but like different versions of ideas, such as being in an unfamiliar place that is also home, of learning and also relearning and unlearning histories of forgotten stories. But the thing that kind of combines all of these works together is a need to kind of connect with other people, and the need to kind of spend time to listen to one another. And I was just wondering, where does that need stem from? That need to kind of talk about your own story through your art, but also in many ways you talk about others' experiences and others' stories as well. You know?
Yeah. I wonder how much of my story comes through in the work that I make, because I intentionally don't put my personal story into the work, but I guess it comes through the topics I choose and the stories I choose, I guess, or the communities I choose to work with. I'm obsessed with the objects that people make when they're in different states of emergency, right? Like, if you've seen the island, the things that people were made when they were stateless on this island, which was in the middle of the ocean, you know, like not connected to any kind of anchor in terms of like nationhood, is extremely fascinating for me. Like, how do people make, and what do they think about, and what do they make, you know? And just even just to think about making when you're stateless, when you're a refugee, is something incredible. So that just to say that I'm interested in people and what they make. And I think objects that people make hold memory. And these objects also tell stories. And so when I make exhibitions, there's a narrative element to the work, the story part. And then there's an object part, a material part to that story. So a lot of the objects that I feature in the films, in the moving image, in the stories, I make it a point to display so that viewers can have this one-to-one relationship with the object, and then relate that to the story. I think there's something really interesting there. Yeah, I think objects are all about memory, you know.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
you know,
I agree.
yeah.
Which is really interesting, I think, when artists make objects out of nothing. Well, not out of nothing. There's always the question of materiality. And I think since we're talking about object, I'm really intrigued with the sculptures that are presented at your current show with your most current show with Wowie, A Dream of the End at the End of a Dream. Because I memorize it. These sculptures that stand by themselves, and they kind of references architecture, but they also references, I guess, the study of space and the universe. One of those works has been acquired recently by the Nguyen Art Foundation, Space Rock. It is as if they're the ruins, but also the monuments, proposals for some kind of monuments for the future. But they could also be something that maybe future archaeologists would find when they look back at what happened in 2021 and 2022. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about these objects in the show.
So actually, there are 3 objects in the show that aren't made collaboratively. And they're actually the only 3 objects that you mentioned.
Yeah.
They're objects that I've been kind of playing with, experimenting with in terms of form and material. And I thought that they offered access aesthetically into some of the topics that were being played around with in the show. It's like futurism, futurity, landscape, memory, and all that stuff. So I decided to put them in. Of course, I talked to Wowie about it, and it was a point of agreement. But those objects kind of stem from one object that I would go around looking for and collecting here in Saigon. And that object is a 16 centimeter by 16 centimeter concrete block. So when they pour concrete for big construction buildings, they have to do a test pour to test the quality of these blocks. And when they test the quality, that block has no more function, right? So they throw that out. And it's, for me, I mean, concrete and cubes have all sorts of references that call to mind, right? Cubism, minimalism,
Land art,
architecture, all sorts of things. I remember that there was a bridge that collapsed in, I think, in, I think, 2014 or something.
Yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't have my numbers with me right now. But it collapsed because the construction company replace the rebar inside with a cheaper material with bamboo. I'm sure you guys remember this story. It was a big story.
Yes.
Yeah.
So sad.
Yeah. So I started kind of thinking about that story, and then I started looking back online to kind of, read about the story again. And then suddenly, like, there are fewer and fewer articles online about that moment. So I just thinking about objects and the disappearance of objects and this material. And I started kind of working with this block and thinking about all sorts of things like memory and future and human existence and stuff like that. So yeah, 3 objects came out of that kind of thinking that were displayed in the show, and I'm still obsessed with that little block. So I've been working with it, and now we're gonna blow it up to a 3-meter object for Imasi International School.
Yeah, I think that's really exciting actually, the point where the conversation about these objects switches to also the conversation about what it means to put these objects in such a scale in a public space. Because it's no longer in the safe space of the gallery or the safe space of the artist studio. It's now entering public memory.
Yeah.
And you're creating new memory.
The Propeller Group is described as an entity between collaborative
An artist collective. Yeah.
and an advertising agency.
Yeah.
So can you tell us how it influenced the production of the work?
Yeah. Well, maybe I can step back a little bit and tell a little story about how the group was influenced by the work.
Okay.
So after I came here, and I grew up, when I was in LA, I was very much into graffiti. So I started seeing graffiti here in 2006. I would see tags by a few people. One of the tags that I saw a lot, mostly in District 5, was Wowie.
Ah.
He was a graffiti artist. He was 17 years old. So I decided, because my background is kind of, I was making documentary films, I decided to make a documentary about the first generation of graffiti artists in Vietnam. And that film became this short film called Nhu Cầu Vẽ Lại. And it featured Wowie in it. And Linkfish and
oh my God, Linkfish.
Linkfish
Years
in
ago.
Hanoi, yeah. And because I was interested, it was a really interesting landscape for me, because on one hand you have a lot of government propaganda. This is, mid 2000s. In the late 90s is when, the embargo was lifted, and all these international companies like PepsiCo and Coca-Cola, kind of flooded this market, right? And with companies like that in Vietnam, they survive on marketing. How else do you sell sugar water to, 100 million people? Marketing. So all these international marketing companies started coming in. And at that time, there was still a lot of propaganda. A lot of it was still old school propaganda. And then slick marketing, advertising at the same time. But there was really no kind of individual kind of public art or like individual expressions in public space. Besides, like people playing checkers or whatever and like eating outside. So I became very interested in this first generation of graffiti artists. I thought, okay, this is something very special. Very special, because between these extremes, right, communist propaganda and capitalist advertising, and this is all Cold War, right? That's what the Cold War was about, these two ideologies. There's a new generation now like exploring, making a mark in public space. Anonymous, of course, but they're making a mark. What is that about? And what is this import of like an American subculture into Vietnam? And then I met Wowie, of course, and he was a really fascinating character, and we became friends from there. So, sorry, to make a long story short, I asked a young aspiring filmmaker named Fu Nam to help me shoot this documentary. We were in public shooting, and we got confronted by the police a couple of times. And of course, we didn't have a permit. Later, we found out that if we had an advertising company or a film production company, then we could easily get a permit to shoot in public and to operate in public. We could rent out billboards, we could create exhibitions, we could do events, we could film in public. So eventually, that's what we did. We started an advertising company, essentially.
Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we were not advertisers. And as a matter of fact, growing up as a graffiti artist, I hated advertising. Because advertising is what our goal was to destroy.
Yeah.
We hated advertising. We would paint over advertising. Ironically, we became an advertising company to help us kind of maneuver. And, you know, it was our way of exploring the complexities and the contradictions of Vietnam at that time of immense growth. You know, from the late 1990s to like maybe 2010 was like this time where Vietnam was changing economically, culturally, the media landscape was changing tremendously, education was changing tremendously, and we were inside of that machine, you know, performing as advertisers to kind of understand what it all meant, you know, and we ourselves were a contradiction. Yeah, so it was pragmatic because we had to earn a living, and we knew how to do media, sort of, you know, so we were asked to do television commercials and music videos and, you know, all that stuff. But at the same time, we were thinking about, you know, the history of the Cold War and what led to this moment in Vietnam and all the contradictions of it all.
But I think
So we were performing. We were performing.
So Vietnam history and culture seems to be the center stage of your work. And at the same time, you've also looked at the different social political issues elsewhere, such as the lives of the undocumented migrants in Europe, and the struggles of the indigenous communities in Australia.
Yeah.
So what links those different narratives, and how did you choose the theme of the works?
So I think, you know, I would define my work, the broad scope of my work, as a search for strategies of resistance. And, you know, a lot of that resistance exists in how we maintain memory, how we as erased peoples struggle not to be erased. And I think that exists in, you know, the story of the Ngururu people in Western Australia. Because of colonialism, their land was taken from them, and memories of, you know, how to survive in the desert were gone. You know, people were mass migrated to cattle farms and stuff. So all that ancient history of where all the secret water holes were, because in the desert you can't survive unless you have water, and the Ngururu people had this ancient knowledge of where all the hidden water holes were. They're called jilas. And that was gone because that memory of those previous generations were now not able to be kept alive. So that is just an example. I think, you know, the 20th century is a century of migration, of displaced people. Historians often talk about the 20th century like that. The 21st century will have a constant continuation of mass migrations, not only due to wars and political reasons, but now environmental reasons. People have to move from where they have lived for thousands of years because the environmental conditions that allow them to survive there are now, causing an emergency. So there's going to be more migration. There's going to be more exodus. There's going to be more displaced peoples. And, a lot of that is very much about memory to me, and how we deal with the memory of where we're from and the memory of the future, how we kind of attempt to approach this idea of a future while we're in this like liminal space of in between.
What memory do you think is instilled in AK-47 versus M16, another work that is in the collection?
Yeah, I'm so glad that work is here in Vietnam.
Yeah, because it beautiful in the most beautiful and poetic way captures a potential moment of destruction and death, So
yeah.
There's so much irony in that work, both visually but in terms of content as well. So I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah. I've been, since a little child in the US, I was obsessed with this object called the AK-47 because I would hear stories that my uncles would talk about. My uncles, of course, were drafted in the Southern Army. But then I have uncles who in Vietnam were, fought with the revolution, with the North. And so many conversations were about the AK-47 and the M16. And they essentially began to symbolize the two sides of the Cold War, essentially. But they were cited in these objects, in these very kind of material objects, these design objects. And so, just hearing stories, I was just really kind of fascinated about it. And, there's a whole kind of trend online where they're still comparing, right, the accuracy and the effectiveness of an AK-47 and an M16. And that's still trending to this day. In our research, we also found that there were, in the American History Museum in the US, they also found this bullet that is the merging of two bullets from the opposite sides of the American Civil War, the North and the South. And back then, because they fought in a traditional style where men would just line up on both sides and shoot at each other, you would think that more bullets would collide. But statisticians and scientists say that it's impossible for bullets to collide, even in that old style of warfare, even when they were shooting big lead bullets. So this one bullet came to symbolize something of the impossible. Like a reprieve from war, where the two bullets didn't reach their target, but they met in the middle and created a third object. And that's what we were interested in as a story. And so we wanted to create that again, but with the AK-47 and the M16. Grand Arts made it possible for us to work with a ballistics testing facility. I think, in Baltimore. So the U.S. has a testing facility of military equipment called Aberdeen, the Aberdeen Testing Grounds, in Maryland. And so, because there's so much work to be done for the U.S., little independent testing facilities popped up, and we found one of these independent testing facilities called Chesapeake Testing. They're engineers, and that's what they do. They test ballistics and you know, weapons and stuff like that.
Wow.
So we asked them if they could help us create these sculptures fused from an AK-47 projectile and a M16 projectile. And what we found out was that it was impossible to fuse these two projectiles because of the technology of the bullets now. They're traveling faster,
Yeah.
and they're made of harder metals. So when they actually got the bullets to hit nose on, head on, which is impossible, but they managed to do it, but then the bullets were just shattered. We recorded this at high speed, and it just looks like, you know, like a galactic Big Bang. It looked beautiful.
Firework.
Yeah, yeah, like, you know, the stars exploding. But we didn't have an object. We didn't have that moment. So in our process working with these engineers, they took us around their facility, you know, on a tour, and then we saw these really beautiful gelatin blocks. And we asked them what those were. And they said, these are FBI ballistics testing blocks. And they mimic the density of human tissue, so, but you can see through them. So you can see how the bullets travel through the body and what kind of damage it creates inside the body. That's the purpose of them. So we, in our kind of desperation, but also in our, you know, I think when you're desperate, you have creative like moments, right?
Very innovative.
Really innovative. And then we asked them if they think that we could collide the bullets inside the gel. And everybody was like, no, that's impossible. Because it was already impossible to collide them in open air because a little shift in temperature, a little wind, you know, would just have a miss. And they missed so many times. And they said now the gelatin isn't consistent. So that adds another element to make it very impossible to kind of collide. But eventually they were able to do it.
Yeah.
And it was amazing. It was amazing because, you know, coming from a background in making moving image, this became a freeze frame of that moment, but it was sculptural. It was three-dimensional, it was material. And we were just like mind-blowing, mind-blowing. And you know, the blocks also, again, reference like minimalism and cubism and all that, all those histories of like, you know, recent art movements. Yeah, it was just like the best feeling that.
Yeah, that work, that particular work reminds me of a Sontag's quote, and you of course you know this quote, and I think it goes something like, just says the camera is a sublimation of the gun. To photograph someone is a subliminal murder, a soft murder. Right?
Yeah.
And I think in the work AK-47 versus M16, you have these killing machines. The forces of these killing machines become so apparent. You have the guns, the bullets colliding, but also you have the camera recording the collision of the bullets.
Yeah.
And in this very instance, I feel that the camera becomes something of a kind of a double-edged sword, because it captures the precarity of history, but at the same time it lures us into this beautification of violence in a way. And so I kind of wonder, you know, you as a filmmaker, but also as a video artist, you have to rely on your camera a lot of the time. How do you kind of deal with this dilemma of like needing to record history or making new history, but also being so aware of the fact that the camera is an offensive, is a destructive, could become an offensive, destructive tool?
Yeah. I think that's where collaboration comes in. And it's I think that's my solution to those issues. We film each other, you know, and we, like you were asking me earlier, most of the scripts that I write are collaborative. I write with the people that I'm making the film with, and I write with the people who are in the film.
Yeah.
And they speak their own words, mostly. And I think that helps me a little bit to kind of think about the power of image, and who controls the camera. I also think about Paul Virilio, you know, his whole kind of text on war and cinema and how, you know, seeing is power, you know, and the whole military complex operates on being able to see closely from afar, from safe distances. And that's, you know, essentially he compares the evolution of cinema to the evolution of war technology. And he's spot on, and there's a relationship between the two. And we play with that relationship, especially during the work, you know, I was working on with the Propeller Group. We were playing around with that relationship, you know, trying to kind of look at the imbalances of those ways of seeing and capturing and documenting.
Tell us more about this project that you're working on, please, if you could.
Yeah, I started, you know, when we were working with weapons during the Vietnam War, AK-47s and M16s, I also came across research about UXO. UXO stands for unexploded ordnance, which are all the mines and bombs that were dropped during the war in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, but didn't explode. And the numbers are that about 30% of all the ordnance used during the war didn't explode. So what's happening with them now? And then I returned back to this idea of memory, because in the central region, which is the most bombed region in all of world history, like Quang Tri specifically, the land holds this memory of war. But it's a memory that could be triggered at any moment.
Literally.
Literally. So that kind of sense of danger and that contradiction of memory and peace and war is something I've been really interested in. And because of the pandemic, and I wasn't able to travel to do these other commissions that I had set in other places, I was able to kind of like focus back and return to this idea of UXO. So I reached out to 3 NGOs, particularly MAG, Mines Advisory Group, Peace Trees, and Project Renew. They're the big NGOs in Quang Tri trying to clear the land of mines and bombs. They've been working here since the late 90s. And they're telling me that it'll be at least another 100 years before they can clear everything, because there's so much. And each one of these organizations has like, you know, 10 to 20 groups out there every day, like finding and exploding and destroying mines and bombs. The statistic is that 15 million tons of ordnance were used during the war. Now, if a third of those didn't explode, that's 5 million tons of ordnance still killing, you know. The other statistic that I find interesting is that 53,000 American soldiers died during the war. Since the end of the war, almost 40,000 Vietnamese civilians, mostly children, have died because of unexploded ordnance. Is that crazy? That the number almost matches the number of soldiers during the war from the American side? So yeah, that memory of the war is not just a memory, it's like something that's there and it's live.
Happening.
Yeah, that's not happening.
I really enjoyed last night just watching not all, but some of your films again, you know, and just be reminded of how relevant They are still today, like even with the island that was made years ago, or MT4, My Alien Beliefs Can Cure Your Wretched Desires, that was 2017. But all of the content of these films are so relevant today still, and I think essentially it is because they all speak about the very thing that is, I think, the core of all of this destruction that just keeps repeating itself, whether it's to do with war or with the animal world or with
The environment,
the environment, which is our greed. Our greed fuels all of these things, and your work always stands at the verge of, directly speaking about this greed, but also, and I'm going to reiterate myself, making this film so beautiful to watch that you can't help but just fall into them, to then be realized, oh, what am I watching? It's not preachy, but there's definitely a message there,
Yeah, I found it so fascinating. I know we're trying to wrap up, but we don't realize here in Vietnam how much of a part we play on the global landscape, right? For instance, just the belief that rhino horn cures cancer has caused the extinction of rhinos all over the world.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's sad.
Pangolin, bears.
And yeah, ooh, bear bile. Also, like, Vietnam is probably one of the top 3 in the world in terms of plastic bag usage and dumping into the sea.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to be working here and working with the people that I work with to kind of explore those issues, and how do we heal from that? How do we resolve those issues?
I think we are also one of the top people who use the protected wood. Those trees from Africa, we imported huge amounts of wood like that.
And that has everything to do with our belief systems and the development of the economy and politics.
Complicated.
Very complicated. It's a meshing of so many tangled webs.
Yeah.